household where we proudly serve alongside my naval chaplain husband, who is currently aboard the USS America. The Navy is what brought our family to South Carolina, but it is my school community that has kept me and my teens here as my husband serves in the Pacific. Now, I began teaching in 1997. I'd love to be able to say that I've taught continuously since then, but my life and career has been interrupted regularly. We've moved a dozen times. I've taught in 4 states and overseas in Japan, in 10 schools in various positions. The one constant in my life has been change, and it's often exhausting. But I'm still teaching. I still believe in the promise that public education extends, especially to our most vulnerable. I still believe in the power of teaching and learning. I still believe that our best shot at freedom is the stream of students walking our halls each day, hopefully learning how to think and act in ways that will expand their freedom and their participation in our society. So I want to talk to you today about longevity, about how to stay the course and finish strong, about how to teach and live on your own terms, and how to leave each place a little better than when you arrived. And it all starts with what you choose to see. In 2000, some social scientists, Daniel Simmons and Chris Chabris, put together a study to test selective attention. And it was fairly simple on the surface. The study participants were asked to watch a video in which 2 teams, one in black shirts and one in white shirts, were passing a ball between their teammates. And the participants are told to count the number of passes between the white-shirted players. And so the video begins and you see people starting to count. But midway through the video, a person dressed in a gorilla suit walks right through the middle of the passes, pounds their chest, and then walks out. And as the video ends, participants start to shout out how many passes they saw. More than half the time, participants never saw the gorilla. And even more so, I love using this with my students because they get very upset. There was not a gorilla, Mrs. Weems. They are certain that they would not have missed something that big walking through the middle of the video. And so they re-watch it incredulous as that gorilla walks through. And I use this video with my students because we explore perspective. They need to understand how powerful their minds are. We will find what we are looking for. We will see what we expect to see. I have to admit that early on in my teaching career, while I was still student teaching, I student taught in middle school, I tended to hone in with laser focus on misbehavior. I worried that any student off task was a reflection of me and was in direct defiance of my authority, that they wouldn't be able to learn. My days were full of redirection, admonishments, and exhaustion. I expected to see kids off task, and I found them. When I was hired for my first job in rural Arizona, I taught one particular class that was especially challenging. It was called General English, which I quickly realized meant they had generally failed English 1 or more times. I had sophomores through 5th-year seniors. There were no materials for the class except for a mismatched set of textbooks. I had no book budget. I had no materials. And this was 1997. So I did have an overhead projector. And there was one computer basically bolted to the wall in the room that was only good to send attendance and sometimes word processing if you could get the dot matrix printer to work. But that class, I went into it hopeful. I was a bright, shiny new teacher. I had ideas. I had written all these wonderful plans in my undergrad. Okay, yes, veterans laugh. I just thought, we'll go to the library. We'll check out books. We'll write creatively. I can't wait for this class. And so I stood at the door in my freshly pressed dress and greeted students as they mostly slumped by me, gave me side eye, and some of them openly eye rolled at me. And it wasn't what I expected to see. But I launched into that first week of lessons. A few students nodded politely, but most really didn't pay attention. They didn't even have materials. And when I handed materials out, they quickly disappeared. I tried to make my lessons more engaging and creative. I planned discussions where no one spoke. I tried tying lessons to songs and videos and all manner of crafts. And then I began to write lunch detentions and redirect and everything I could think of to get them to participate in my class. But nothing worked. They hated reading. They refused to write. I was at my wit's end. My first semester, I had an entire class fully prepared to fail, and I didn't seem to be able to do anything about it. There was so much out of my control. But one day, a student showed up in the same clothes he had worn the day before, no backpack, looking like he had been up all night, and he had. And as he came in, students buzzed around him, and I noticed that they were checking on him, asking him if he was okay, asking about his brother. And I looked at the lesson plans and handouts I had on my desk, and I set them aside, and I walked up to this young man, and I said, "Are you okay?" And he collapsed in a chair, and as our class huddled around him, a story poured out of him. His brother, the night before, high on meth, had barricaded himself inside their home with a gun in an all-night standoff with police. Shots had been fired, his brother had been wounded, but had lived, and their family home was still surrounded by police tape. My student had stayed up all night, and then he had come to school. He had come to school, to my class, which I was pretty sure he hated. That day, we sat around him, we let him talk, we let him cry, we let him rage. There was no English done that day. But more importantly, humanity and real community emerged that day. And it began to change everything. And it was slow, but I started to see that class differently. I started asking questions instead of assuming that I knew why students weren't engaged. I gave choices and consistently asked how I could help, how I could support. And their stories began to emerge, stories of abuse and neglect, and just, they had a hard semester. Our system doesn't work for all kids at all seasons and stages of life. And when I stopped looking at them as troublemakers or antagonists and started to see them through their potential, I raised all my expectations and I began to hunt the good. There were still things I had to correct. Oh yes, there were. Things that couldn't be ignored, but I began to address those quietly with dignity. And as I began to encourage to find small wins, suddenly there seemed to be small successes popping up everywhere. Granted, sometimes those looked like that spring, all of my poetry books disappeared because students were taking them home, which is the best thing ever. They would come in quoting Langston Hughes with a little bit of colorful additions. It was very creative, very creative. But my gosh, it was astonishing. And I realized that we all have to function under conditions that are less than ideal from time to time. And I don't need to know why you've had a hard day to extend a smile and say, "I am so glad you're here. How can I help you today?" I owe that class more than I could ever repay. It was not their burden to teach me, but they did. They taught me to teach. They taught me to lean into failure. They taught me to ask questions, and they taught me not to give up on students. They taught me how to see. Had the students changed? Not really. My perception of them had changed, all because I began to look for something new. I changed my focus, and I began to find the good that I was looking for. As we struggle for change in public education, let's not forget to see all of the amazing things around us. We are still going to have to address the issues. Of course we are. But don't let those overshadow all the amazing things that you are doing every day in your communities. My general English students had significant barriers, but most of them passed and were able to graduate. Not because of me. Oh no, I didn't save them. They saved themselves. I just listened and created space for them to do what they needed to do together. And isn't that what most of us ultimately need? We want to feel understood and valued. But hear this. You cannot be understood or valued fully without boundaries. I have a dear friend who began teaching online for a public charter in another state a few years ago. She wanted more flexibility with her schedule. Within 6 months, though, she was working 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, serving close to 300 students online, barely meeting her grading and contact quotas. She was harried and stressed out. Her health was suffering. She knew she was doing as well as she could under the conditions, but she lamented not being able to do more. And I listened to her in utter astonishment. And I looked her straight in the eye and said, you have got to stop. You have to stop. You are working far outside your contractual obligations. And worse, you're doing a good job at it. Right? Some of you are doing this too. I'm not stepping on your toes on purpose, maybe. But admin sees you, they see you being successful with your students, working so much. And so they look at teachers who are working 40 and 50 hours a week and think they're failing when they're not. And she said, but this is my calling. My kids need me. Listen, you can walk fully in your calling and have good boundaries and be whole. She was drawing her worth from her 80 to 90-hour work weeks. Her value is entirely bound up with her student-parent satisfaction and her pass rate in her classes. Yes, you are a teacher and your contribution is valuable, life-changing, long-lasting, but you are more than a teacher. You are a partner or spouse, a friend, a daughter or a son, a mom or a dad, a grandparent, a neighbor, and those relationships matter, and they will matter long after you retire. We have to keep the long game in view. Stop defining our worth solely by our current positions. And if you are not a teacher but an ally, keep reminding the teachers in your life that they have value outside their classroom, because it's really easy for us to forget it. It took me a number of years to learn this, and this is not a story I've told publicly before. As an active duty military spouse, I haven't always been able to find a teaching job. One of the few benefits of being an unemployed teacher is this: it forced me to know who I was outside of a classroom. It forced me to find community outside the school walls. In October 2004, my husband went back on active duty and we moved to 29 Palms, California. Our kids were 4, 3, and 1. And there was no base housing, and so we moved into a rental about 20 miles off base. 3 months later, in the first few days of January 2005, my husband deployed with his unit to Fallujah, Iraq. If you remember, that was the January that they began their first democratic elections. I didn't know a soul. We found a church near the base where I tried to attend when I could get everyone up and dressed and out of the house on time. I met a few other moms and hoped our kids would get along. I attended the command spouse group events and awkwardly sat in corners, wondering if anywhere would ever feel like home again. And more than anything, I missed teaching. I missed feeling competent, where bells rang and buses came and I knew when the day began and ended. I missed being able to check for understanding and see the proof of learning on paper and faces each day. Being home with 3 preschoolers tested me in ways I hadn't expected. And theoretically, I know I was teaching my kids, but preschoolers are so far outside my comfort zone. God bless you if you teach early. I don't even know. They aren't rational, okay? And I had 3 of them. And let me tell you what they taught me in that season. 4 words. Go to bed now. No, I'm kidding. That wasn't with it. I did say that a lot. What I learned was this. This too shall pass. And I learned these words and I muttered them through times of anger and joy and fear and every emotion in between. They frosted couches with peanut butter. True story, that child is still alive. And they cut each other's hair to the scalp, right here, right before birthday pictures. This too shall pass. They loved karaoke and car washes and stories. This too shall pass. They got kicked out of the nursery at church and sweet-talked grannies into all manner of nonsense. And this too shall pass. And listen, I love my kids. The 3 I kept alive through that 7-month deployment and the son that we adopted a 1.5 years later. But I really struggled through that time. And I didn't really fully understand why until much, much later. I was grieving. I was grieving a number of things, but one of the hardest was feeling like I'd lost my identity as a teacher. Stepping away from the classroom forced me to face myself without whiteboard markers and lesson plans. And I didn't know that person very well because I had invested so heavily in her for so many years. And as a new mother of 3 and a new military spouse living 8 hours from the nearest family member, it was just hard. I muddled through, forcing myself to get out of the house, meeting neighbors between nap times, hanging out with other military spouses struggling through the loneliness. And some of those friends are still some of my dearest people today, even though they're scattered from Abu Dhabi to Japan, to Washington, to Virginia. But have you considered who you are when you are not teaching? Have you invested in that person? Do you have a community outside your school walls? For many of us, our identity is so closely entwined with our profession that when things at work are hard, it negatively impacts every other area of our lives. And it's part of what leads to burnout, this inability to leave school behind. And listen, I know, I've had those years when I am haunted, when kids and their stories follow me home. We do everything in our power to help them, but I've also learned I have to acknowledge limits. And sometimes setting those limits requires that we reframe what we're doing. You've all heard the story about the guy who throws back the starfish, saving them one by one. They love this at the beginning of the year thing. Have you all heard this before? I'm not going to retell it. You can go look it up. I cringe when they tell that story. It's often told to just remind us that we make a difference. And we do. We do make a difference, one student at a time. But like my general English class, students do not need us to save them. They need us to walk alongside them with dignity as they embrace the agency in their own lives. Stop viewing yourself as their savior. It's too heavy. It's not yours to bear. Let them own their stories. When we believe our job is to save them, it's a disservice to them, to us, and to our loved ones who need us to be whole and present when we are not at work. You cannot work your way out of burnout. Teaching is a never-ending to-do list. You could work on that list 80 to 90 hours a week like my friend who taught online, but the list would still be unfinished. I have finished school year with things still. We could say the same for advocacy. Your time is finite. You cannot create or buy more. Find who you are outside your classroom and build some boundaries around your time. Abandon guilt. When you live a full life, you bring fresh air into your classroom each Monday. This is how you stay. You see yourself and your students with kindness, knowing you can walk together for a time, but ultimately that we each have to travel our own path. And as the teacher, academic, and psychologist Ram Dass says, we're all just walking each other home. As I close, I'd like to challenge you to see your value with new eyes today. Resilience is born of finding the good around us while we name and address issues head on, knowing the difficult days grow us and that they'll pass. Advocacy is about beginning or continuing to tell your story, about what public education has meant to you. Advocacy means speaking up, interceding for those who don't have a voice, first for yourself, and then for colleagues and your students. It doesn't have to be a formal speech or a policy document or a march. Sometimes it looks like speaking out against over-testing and policies that are not in the best interests of our students. And sometimes it looks like showing up to a student's football game. Sometimes advocacy looks like calling your representative, and sometimes it looks like going fishing or taking a hike. Sometimes advocacy looks like a hard conversation with an administrator, and sometimes it looks like leaving school at 4:30. This is the only way to stay the course long term. Change is constant. And teaching is not going to get easier, but we are going to get stronger. So I encourage you, tell your story, build your boundaries, advocate, and stay the course. Thank you for your time today.